My name is Elias Thorne, and I am 55 years old. If you looked at me on a random Tuesday, sitting in a quiet corner of the Skyline Tower, you might assume I was a mid-level manager. I favor comfortable blazers, well-worn leather Oxfords, and the kind of silence that usually unnerves people used to corporate chatter. I do not wear a company lanyard or carry a walkie-talkie. I am not the guy you call when your printer jams or when you forget your email password. I am something much more foundational. I am the independent infrastructure architect and the master leaseholder for the technological backbone of the entire commercial zone. Most startups think that when they rent a floor with a nice view, everything just magically appears. They think the lightning-fast internet, the redundant power grids, and the specialized cooling systems that keep their massive server racks from melting down are just part of the basic package. They are entirely wrong. The base lease provides 4 walls, standard heating, and standard electricity. The high-speed fiber trunks, the dedicated chilled water loops, and biometric security gateways are specialized add-ons. Years ago, I bought the master license for that digital infrastructure. I designed it, I maintain it, and I lease it out. I am the landlord of the invisible world. On the day the chaos started, I was sitting on the 37th floor. The light in the main executive conference room was spectacular, pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows. I had commandeered the massive mahogany table, spreading out the physical blueprints and the legally binding infrastructure renewal contract for the floor's current tenant, Apex Dynamics. Apex was a hyper-growth startup that burned through cash and patience in equal measure. I had spent the last 4 months negotiating this 10-year extension with their executive team. The contract sitting under my hands guaranteed their server redundancy, prioritized their freight elevator access, and secured their fiber optic bandwidth. Without it, they were just a bunch of guys in a hot room with terrible internet. I was tracing a complex cooling loop schematic with my fountain pen, entirely focused on ensuring the upcoming summer heat wave wouldn't fry their hardware when the sound cut through the room. It was a sharp, percussive snap of fingers ringing out right near my ear. It is a sound that immediately signals entitlement. It's the kind of noise you make at a disobedient dog. Hey, IT guy, Earth to IT guy. I finished my line on the schematic, capped my pen with a deliberate click, and finally turned my swivel chair. Standing there was Donovan. Donovan was 26 years old, and his official title was Director of Visionary Operations. As far as anyone could tell, that title was a direct result of his father, Richard Caldwell, being the vice president of the holding company that funded Apex Dynamics. Donovan was the embodiment of unearned confidence. He was wearing an expensive, puffy fleece vest over a designer button-down. His face was flushed red, and he was gesturing frantically toward the glass wall behind him. Inside the adjacent suite, a group of similarly dressed young executives were staring in panic at a massive flat-screen monitor. The video feed on the screen was frozen in a pixelated mess. The Wi-Fi, Donovan spat, his voice dripping with condescensions. It's lagging. We are pitching the Series B guys in exactly 3 minutes. You need to fix it now. I took a slow, deep breath, assessing the situation. I looked at Donovan's frantic expression, then at the frozen screen, and finally down at my tailored blazer. I was clearly not a member of the help desk. I am not your IT support, Donovan, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I am reviewing the infrastructure specifications for your upcoming lease renewal. If you are experiencing latency issues, you need to submit a standard ticket to the building portal. Donovan let out a harsh laugh. Excuse me? I don't submit tickets. I tell people to do their jobs. You are sitting here with a laptop, aren't you? Go reboot the router, reset the mainframe. Just make the internet work before I lose a $50 million investment. I am currently busy, I replied, turning my chair back toward the mahogany table. Furthermore, I do not have administrative access to your local area network. Donovan stepped forward and slammed his open palm down on the conference table, rattling my coffee cup. The sound was loud enough that the entire open-plan office beyond the glass walls suddenly went dead silent. Developers stopped typing. Dozens of eyes turned toward the conference room. You know what? Donovan shouted, his face now a furious crimson. I am absolutely sick of the attitude from the support staff in this building. My father pays an absolute fortune for this lease, and I can't even get a stable connection. You are useless. You are actually useless to me. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the glass door leading out to the elevators. Get out. You are fired. I don't want to see you on this floor ever again. I will have HR send your final check, pack your garbage, and go. I froze, out of a deep scientific fascination with the sheer magnitude of his mistake. He was firing me. He actually believed he had the authority to fire me. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the silent office workers watching the drama unfold. Then, I looked down at the heavy folder under my hands. The folder contained the unsigned infrastructure renewal contract. It was the legal document that guaranteed Apex Dynamics had the power, cooling, and internet required to run their entire business. You are firing me? I asked, making sure my voice carried. I am firing you, Donovan spat, leaning over the table. Get your things and get out of my sight right now. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain commercial real estate law. I simply closed my laptop. I picked up my leather folio, deliberately leaving the massive, unsigned renewal contract sitting dead center on the mahogany table. Understood, I said calmly, standing up and smoothing my blazer. Good luck with your Series B pitch, Donovan. I walked out of the conference room and headed straight for the elevators. I could feel 40 pairs of eyes tracking my every move, but I didn't rush. I pressed the call button, waited for the pleasant chime, and stepped inside. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of Donovan aggressively high-fiving a colleague, entirely convinced he had just asserted dominance. He hadn't solved anything. He had just taken a hatchet to the main artery keeping his entire company alive. He just didn't know it yet. The elevator ride down to the lobby was smooth. Skyline Tower prides itself on its elevators. High speed, whisper quiet, serviced weekly. I know they are serviced weekly because I am the one who signs the vendor invoices. I stepped out into the lobby, the cool air conditioning hitting my face, and nodded to the security chief. Stan was a burly man who monitored the camera bank with the intensity of a hawk. Afternoon, Mr. Thorne, Stan grunted, his eyes barely leaving the screens. Everything good up on 37? Not anymore, Stan, I said, offering a tight, polite smile. Not anymore. Exactly 10 minutes later, just enough time for me to walk to the coffee shop across the street, order a double espresso, and take a seat by the window. The chaos started upstairs. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't need to be. I knew the script perfectly, mostly because I had written the stage directions. Up on the 37th floor, Calvin, the building manager, walked out of the service elevator. Calvin is a good man. He is 60 years old, wears suits that are slightly too large for him, and sweats profusely when things go off script. He was carrying a notary stamp in one hand and a bottle of expensive champagne in the other. He was there to celebrate the signing of the 10-year lease extension. Calvin walked into the glass-walled conference room. He saw the folder I had left on the table. He saw Donovan and his team, still riding high on adrenaline and desperately low on situational awareness. Afternoon, gentlemen, Calvin boomed, trying his best to be jovial. Where is he? Where's our man of the hour? We have some ink to dry. Donovan spun around, looking annoyed at the interruption. Who is that person? Elias, Calvin said, looking around the room. He said he was setting up in here. We need to finalize the infrastructure rider before 5 o'clock, or the grandfather clause on your cooling unit expires. Donovan scoffed, grabbing a can of energy drink from the mini-fridge. Oh, him! The old guy with the attitude. Yeah, I fired him. The room stopped. It wasn't a quiet stop. It was the kind of stop where the air gets violently sucked out of the room. The developers in the back row lowered their headphones. The HR director, a woman who actually knew exactly who I was, but had been in the bathroom during the incident, walked in just in time to hear this. Her face went the color of bleached paper. Calvin blinked. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. I'm sorry. Donovan, you did what? I fired him, Donovan repeated, speaking slower as if he were talking to a toddler. He was incompetent. He couldn't fix the Wi-Fi. He gave me lip, so I told him to pack up and get out. You are welcome, by the way. We need better vendors. Calvin stared at him. He stared at the empty chair where I had been sitting. He stared at the unsigned contract on the mahogany table. Donovan, Calvin said, his voice trembling slightly. Elias isn't a vendor. He's not. Whatever he. Elias is the landlord, Calvin whispered. What? Technically, he is the independent infrastructure overseer and leaseholder for the commercial zones. Calvin said, his volume rising as sheer panic set in. He owns the rights to the fiber trunk you use. He owns the lease on the backup generators. He holds the master agreement for this entire floor. I just manage the janitors. Donovan, he decides if this building has a pulse. Donovan laughed nervously. You're joking. He was looking at a laptop. He was rewriting your lease. He was rewriting your lease, Calvin yelled. You fired the person who was about to save you $2 million in retroactive utility fees. Donovan's smile finally faltered. He looked at the folder on the table. He reached out and flipped it open. There on the first page, in bold Arial font, it read, Infrastructure Reliance Agreement prepared by Elias Thorne. Oh, Donovan said, a small, weak sound escaping his throat. While they were panicking, I was walking back into the building. My office is not on the 37th floor. It is on the 4th floor, tucked behind the mechanical rooms and the freight elevator banks. It doesn't have a view of the city skyline. It has a view of the backup diesel generators and the massive cooling towers that hum with a low, calming vibration. This is the actual brain of the building. I unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of ozone and expensive paper. I sat down at my desk, a sprawling slab of oak covered in monitors, and woke up my workstation. I didn't feel angry. Anger is inefficient and messy. What I felt was a profound sense of obligation to the terms of the contract. Donovan had been very clear. He didn't want me there. He didn't want my services. As a professional, I was bound to respect his wishes. Under the legal framework of the revocable license doctrine, he had verbally and publicly terminated my license to operate on their behalf. I pulled the Apex Dynamics binder from the shelf. I opened it to Section 14, labeled Revocable Privileges and Shared Utilities. I opened the building management software. My access level is Root Administrator. Step 1. The Elevator Priority Protocol. Apex paid a premium for VIP lift access. I found the clause. Contract status. Negotiation terminated by tenant. I clicked the checkbox to revert them to standard access. Step 2. The Climate Control. The building's central air keeps the offices at 72 degrees, but a server room generates massive heat. It needs a dedicated chilled water loop to keep the equipment from frying. That loop is my property. I pulled up the HVAC schematic. The flow to Suite 3700 was currently set to high priority. I typed in a new command, setting it to base building standard. The valve actuators on the roof would take about an hour to close. By tomorrow morning, their server room would be a sauna. I pressed execute. The chain reaction had begun. The beauty of infrastructure is its invisibility. When it works perfectly, you don't even know it exists. You walk through a door, and it opens. You breathe the air, and it's comfortably cool. You flush a toilet, and it works. You assume these are natural laws of the universe, not highly specialized services rendered by a meticulously negotiated contract. On the 37th floor, the laws of physics were rapidly changing. It started small. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, the smart glass in the executive conference room, the expensive frosted panels that turn opaque for privacy at the touch of a button, stopped responding. It reverted to its default state, which was entirely transparent. Donovan was in the middle of a private, frantic yelling match with his logistics coordinator, and suddenly the entire office could see him pacing and gesticulating wildly like a mime trapped in a glass box. I watched it happen on the security feed. It was like silent theater. Then came the biometric locks, the interior doors of their suite, separating the developer bullpen from the executive wing, were secured by fingerprint scanners. Those scanners routed through my local server. I had disabled the account. The doors didn't lock permanently. That would be a fire hazard. Instead, they failed safe. They popped open and refused to latch. Suddenly, the highly exclusive executive wing was open to everyone. Junior interns wandered in looking confused. The noise from the sales floor, the ringing phones, and the general chatter flooded into Donovan's sanctuary. But the real panic set in just after 4 o'clock. I have a dashboard that monitors tenant tickets. Usually, these go to the building management, but because the infrastructure is mine, I get copied on anything tagged critical. Ticket number 942, server room temperature alert. Current temperature 78 degrees, rising rapidly. Ticket number 943, bathroom access denied. Executive washroom keycards are not working. Ticket number 944. Internet flickering. Packet loss at 40%. Donovan had called me the IT guy. He didn't understand what IT actually ran on. The fiber trunk they used was a split line. Without my prioritization code, their massive data packets were now fighting for bandwidth with the dental call center on the 8th floor. The dentists were downloading massive X-ray files. Apex's video calls started looking like 8-bit video game art. I sat in my office sipping sparkling water, watching the temperature gauge for Suite 3700 climb. 79 degrees, 80 degrees. My email pinged. It was from Donovan. The subject line read glitch. The body of the email was brief. Hey, the AC is acting up and the doors are weird. Can you take a look? Need it fixed right away. There was no apology. There was no recognition of his mistake. It was just a demand. He still thought I was the help desk. He still thought he had the power. I didn't reply. I simply archived the email into a folder labeled Evidence of Unauthorized Service Requests. 5 minutes later, the internal phone rang. It was Calvin again. Elias, he's screaming in the lobby, Calvin whispered frantically. He says the building is attacking him. He's trying to get the maintenance guy to hack the thermostat. He can't hack the thermostat, I said calmly. It's encrypted with a 256-bit key. It's hardwired into the lease logic controller. I know that, Calvin said, but Donovan doesn't. He's threatening to sue the building for breach of habitable workspace. Let him, I replied. The base lease guarantees a temperature of 74 degrees for standard office space. It does not guarantee cooling for a high-density server farm. That was an addendum, the one he didn't sign. While Donovan was sweating through his fleece vest upstairs, I was straightening my blazer. I had a dinner meeting scheduled. I walked across the street to a high-end steakhouse, the kind of place where the steaks are dry-aged for weeks and the waiters know your name. I was meeting Julian Pierce, the CEO of Solstice Tech. Solstice was Apex's direct competitor. They were a solid company that had been trying to get a foothold in Skyline Tower for 2 years. They were currently crammed into a sublet on the 12th floor, desperate for more bandwidth and better cooling for their own expansion. Julian stood up when I arrived. He was a man in his 50s, impeccable and polite. We shook hands. I slid into the booth and placed a thin folder on the table. I have a unique situation, Julian, I began. A massive block of high-priority infrastructure capacity has just become available. Immediate availability. Redundant fiber loop, dedicated chilled water cooling, and VIP elevator priority. Julian raised an eyebrow. I thought Apex had that locked down for another 5 years. The renewal was a formality. The renewal was rejected, I said, choosing my words carefully. The tenant representative terminated the negotiation and the service provider effectively immediately. By doing so, they triggered a breach of essential services contract. The capacity is open. Julian stared at me. He didn't ask for the gossip. He looked at the opportunity. How much capacity? Enough to run your new artificial intelligence division, I said. And since the physical infrastructure is already routed to the riser, I can divert the bandwidth to your floor in about 10 minutes. The cost is standard market rate, plus a signing bonus for the expedited service and a 5-year commitment. Julian smiled. It was the smile of a predator who just found an open gate. Elias, if you can get me that bandwidth by tomorrow morning, I will sign the 5-year deal tonight. I have the contract right here, I said. We spent the next hour reviewing the clauses. Julian didn't snap his fingers. He asked intelligent questions. He treated me like what I was, the landlord. As I signed the counter-signature, my phone buzzed. It was an alert from the building system. Tenant 3700 was attempting unauthorized access to the breaker panel. Donovan was getting desperate. I walked out of the restaurant with a signed contract worth $1.2 million. I had just sold Donovan's bandwidth to his biggest rival. The next morning, the legal machinery finally ground into gear. I was in my office at 8 o'clock. I like the mornings. The building is waking up, the systems are ramping up, and the humming of the servers is steady. I watched the graphs on my monitors. Tenant 1200, Solstice Tech, was showing a bandwidth usage spike with 98% efficiency. Tenant 3700, Apex Dynamics, was showing critical packet loss and a server room temperature of 84 degrees. At exactly 8:15, The phone rang. It wasn't the internal line. It was an outside number. "This is Elias," I answered. "Mr. Thorne, this is Martin Brooks, General Counsel for Apex Dynamics Parent Corporation." His voice was smooth, expensive, and currently strained to the breaking point. "I am looking at a very disturbing report from our satellite office. They claim the building is experiencing a catastrophic failure of services." "Mr. Brooks," I said pleasantly, "I am familiar with the situation. However, I would correct your terminology. The building is functioning perfectly. The services to Suite 3700 have simply been aligned with their current contractual status." "Contractual status?" Martin paused. I could hear him shuffling papers. "I have a lease agreement here that runs for another 5 years. You have a base lease for the square footage," I corrected. "Please refer to the addendum regarding technological amenities. It states clearly that high-speed fiber, enhanced cooling, and security integration are month-to-month services provided by the infrastructure overseer. And your on-site representative, Donovan, terminated the provider of those services yesterday. Verbally and publicly, he explicitly dismissed the renewal negotiation and fired me." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "He fired you?" Martin asked, his smooth veneer cracking. "He did. He mistook me for a technician, insulted my competence, and ordered me off the premises. As per the harassment clause and the revocable license doctrine, I complied immediately. Elias." Martin's voice dropped an octave. "You and I both know Donovan is excitable. He's the vice president's son. But we cannot have these systems offline. We are bleeding data. What do we need to do to fix this?" "Well," I said, leaning back in my chair, "usually, I would simply reopen the negotiation. But unfortunately, the capacity that Apex released has already been acquired by another client. You sold our internet?" Martin sounded like he was choking. "I sold the available internet," I said. "I can't sit on empty inventory, Martin." "Okay," Martin said, his breathing shallow. "Look, I am going to call the vice president. We need a meeting today. I am fully booked today." I lied. "I can squeeze you in on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Monday? That's 3 days. The servers will melt by Monday. I suggest you tell them to power down non-essential systems," I said calmly. "Have a good weekend, Martin. A skyscraper is a living organism. If you stop feeding it, it starts to die." By Friday afternoon, the 37th floor was completely unlivable. The temperature had stabilized at a sweltering 86 degrees. The air was stale because the circulation fans defaulted to minimum turnover. It smelled of warm plastic and desperation. Most of the staff had gone home. Only Donovan and a skeleton crew remained, trying to salvage the hardware with portable plastic fans. Then came Monday morning. At exactly 9 o'clock, the system went into its dark phase. It was an automated expiration. The electronic keycards used by the staff had a rolling encryption code that updated every 72 hours via the network. If the network was down, the keys stopped working. It was a security feature. The network was down, so the update failed. I arrived at the lobby at 8:45. It was a scene of beautiful chaos. 30 employees from Apex were standing at the security turnstiles. They were swiping their badges. Beep, red light. Beep, red light. "What is going on?" One of the developers yelled at Stan, the security guard. "My badge says expired. Can't let you up without a valid badge," Stan grunted. Donovan was there. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same clothes as Friday. He hadn't shaved. He saw me walk in. I was wearing a crisp cream-colored suit and holding a fresh coffee. I breezed past the turnstiles, tapped my MasterCard, got a green light, and walked through. "You!" Donovan shouted, lunging over the velvet rope. Stan stepped in front of him, massive arms crossed. "Back up, sir. She's doing this. He locked us out!" Donovan screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. I stopped and turned. The lobby was crowded. "I didn't lock you out, Donovan," I said, my voice carrying clearly. "Your security protocol requires a network handshake to validate credentials. You don't have a network, therefore you have no credentials." "Fix it!" he screamed. "Just fix it!" "I have a meeting at 9 o'clock, I said, checking my watch. "Are you the representative? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a trespasser." I turned and stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of Donovan, trying to explain to his own employees why they couldn't go to work. Up on the 37th floor, it was a ghost town, and I was the one holding the eviction notice. The conference room on the fourth floor is nothing like the glass box upstairs. It is windowless, soundproofed, and lit by harsh fluorescent strips. It is an interrogation room disguised as a meeting space. At 9 o'clock sharp, the heavy door opened. Calvin walked in first, looking intensely relieved that I was taking the lead. Then came Martin Brooks, the lawyer, looking exhausted. Following him was Richard Caldwell, the vice president and Donovan's father. Richard was a short man, mostly bald, with eyes like flint. He wore a suit that easily cost more than my annual salary. Finally, Donovan trailed in. He looked like a beaten dog, but the kind of dog that would still bite if you turned your back. They sat down on one side of the table. I sat on the other side alone. Elias. Richard Caldwell started, his voice gravelly. Let's cut the crap. We are losing $50,000 an hour. My son made a mistake. He thought you were support staff. He was stressed. We apologize. He nudged Donovan hard in the ribs. Donovan looked down at the table. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I shouldn't have fired you. Can we just turn the internet back on now? I looked at Donovan. Then I looked at Richard. Richard, I said, your son didn't just mistake me. He publicly humiliated the person responsible for the structural integrity of your business. But that's personal. I can get over personal. The problem here is strictly professional. I opened my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is the renewal contract for the infrastructure, I said. Richard reached for it eagerly. Fine, we will sign it right now. Same terms? No, I said, pulling the paper back slightly out of his reach. This is the voided contract. Excuse me, Martin Brooks asked, leaning forward. As of Friday evening, the bandwidth allocation previously reserved for Apex Dynamics was released to the open market, I explained slowly. It has been purchased. Purchased? Richard's eyes widened in horror. By whom? Solstice Tech, I said. Richard slammed his hand onto the table. Solstice, the guys across the street. You sold our fiber to our competitors? I sold my fiber, I corrected him calmly, to a paying client with a signed contract. You didn't have a contract, Richard. You had a handshake and a renewal that your representative literally threw in my face. Undo it, Richard commanded. Cancel their deal. Give it back to us. We will pay double whatever they offered. I can't, I said. It is a 5-year binding agreement. The penalties for breach are astronomical. Besides, they are already using it. Their traffic is live. So, what are you saying? Donovan piped up, his voice cracking. We just don't have internet? You have the base building internet, I said, DSL speeds. It is good for email, but very bad for whatever it is you do. Visionary operations, I believe. We can't run the platform on DSL, Donovan shouted. Then I suggest you relocate, I said coldly, because this building can no longer support your needs. Richard Caldwell stared at me. He looked at his son. He looked at his lawyer. He realized finally the absolute magnitude of the screw-up. You are evicting us, Richard whispered. Without serving an eviction notice, you are starving us out. I am just the landlord, I said, standing up and gathering my things. I just provide the walls. What you do inside them is entirely up to you. But if you want cooling, power, and data, you need a friend in infrastructure, and you don't have one anymore. I walked to the door and paused with my hand on the knob. Oh, and Donovan, the freight elevator is booked solid tomorrow. Solstice Tech is moving in their new server racks. You will have to wait until Wednesday to move your things out. I would suggest using the stairs. The move-out was incredibly painful to watch, which is exactly why I watched every single second of it on the security monitors. On Wednesday, the Apex team began their strategic relocation. That is corporate speak for running away in shame. Because I had blocked the freight elevator for emergency maintenance. A loose bolt I found very dangerous. They had to use the small service elevator. They had to dismantle their massive server racks piece by piece. Donovan wasn't there to help. I heard through the grapevine that Richard Caldwell had immediately reassigned his son. Donovan was now the director of special projects at a satellite office in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I checked the specifications for that particular office. It is located in an old warehouse district. The internet there is entirely copper wire. Good luck, Donovan. Solstice Tech moved into the 37th floor 2 months later. Apex broke their lease early, paying a massive penalty that went straight into the building owners' pockets. The owners, in turn, gave me a very nice bonus for aggressive yield management. Solstice is a great tenant. They submit their tickets properly. They say please and thank you. They even bring donuts to stand the security guard. 6 months later, I was sitting in my basement office, checking the monitors. The temperature on the 37th floor was a stable 72 degrees. Bandwidth was optimal. Tenant satisfaction was at 100%. The building hummed around me. It was breathing, it was alive, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. My dignity was perfectly intact. My bonus had cleared. And somewhere in Oklahoma, Donovan was probably sitting in the heat, waiting for a PDF to load. We are all taught that the universe doesn't hand out justice. But sometimes, if you manage the infrastructure properly, justice finds the right inbox. This story was absolute proof that quiet moves beat loud egos every single time.